Samba and NFS. In this nugget, we're going to talk about sharing files over the network in Linux. We'll start by talking about Samba, which allows Linux machines and Windows machines to share files, and then we'll talk about NFS, the network file system, which is the most common way to share files and directories across networked Linux machines. So pull up a chair and let's get to work. All right, well, let's start with a little overview of Samba. Samba uses what's called the Session Message Block Protocol, abbreviated SMB. That's where the name Samba came from. And the most typical reason to use Samba is to allow Windows machines and Linux machines to interact. All right, so let me just walk you through a little scenario here of what we're going to do in this nugget. What we're going to do is we're going to set up our Linux box so that certain directories and files are shared. Okay, and we can control how they're shared, whether they're shared as a read-only or shared as a read-write system, whatever. We'll learn how to set all that up. So we set up our Linux box that way, and then from a Windows machine, we can basically access these shares from Windows, and on our Windows machine it looks like any other Windows directory. Okay, we're just going to double click on some folder icon and another bunch of folders and files are going to show up, and all those folders and files are going to be living over on the Linux machine, but to our Windows machine it looks no different. Okay, and the same thing goes vice versa. We can also set up shares on Windows machines and then interact with them from Linux. So I could mount those shares on my Linux machine, and then I can use all my Linux commands like cd and ls to navigate around those shares that are on Windows. Again, because we're using the Session Message Block Protocol that is basically that's native to Windows, but Linux uses Samba to get to use that protocol, and so that allows Linux and Windows to interact. You can also interact between two Linux machines with Samba. I mean, if I have some Samba shares set up on this Linux machine, well, I can use a Samba client on a different Linux machine to mount those shares and poke around. There's other ways to interact between Linux machines as well, but Samba is one way that a lot of people do that use that protocol to interact between Linux machines. So there's very simple to very complex configurations of Samba. The man page for samba.conf, which is the configuration file for Samba, is like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long. I mean, the number of settings and all the different variables and all the different parameters is just immense. So you can have very, very complex configurations. Needless to say, what we're going to do in this nugget is just set up a very simple configuration. And like I said, the configuration file for Samba is called samba.conf. On my SUSE Linux machine, that lives in the /etc/samba directory. In some other versions of Linux, it's just right in the etc directory. It'll be etc/smb.conf. Okay, so that's the basic layout of the Samba system. Let's look at how the configuration file is laid out. So there are three special sections in the configuration file: global, homes, and printers. They're all pretty much self-explanatory. The global section in the configuration file is global configuration settings. So everything I said here applies to everything else later in the config file. However, if I reassign some value later for a particular section like homes, that overrides the global setting. So global is kind of like your setup, but if you need to just change like one setting for one particular other section, then you change it in that section. That overrides the global setting. The homes section is what allows us to share users' home directories. And then there's a printers section that allows us to define shared printer access. Okay, so let's look more here. There's also user-defined sections that can be in the smb.conf configuration file. So for instance, I can define a section called programs, and then I can define a bunch of values under this section. Like I can say, okay, what's the path that I want to share? So /user local programs. This is going to be the directory that gets shared via this configuration file setting. I can say, yes, it's true that it's writable, so people can write to it, but then I can restrict who's allowed to access this, and I could say, well, valid users are Joe. Okay, so only Joe is allowed to write to anything in user local programs. Then I can say, well, I'll make it browsable. So I'll say browsable equals yes. That means other users can poke around and read in here, but only Joe will be able to write. And then I can also set change mod settings like 0700. So this would be the settings that would be placed when someone is writing to the particular files and creating files in this directory. Okay, and this is just one of a plethora of options. I mean, the number of different parameters you can set. I said here there's a zillion of them. That's an exaggeration, but like I said, the samba.conf man page is like, you know, hundreds and hundreds of pages long. You can do all sorts of things in the configuration file. You can require passwords. You can limit by the host. So you can say, I only want certain local network hosts to be able to do this. I can limit by the time of day, so only during working hours this can happen, but not off hours. I can limit, I can just go on and on and on here. So if you're interested in some complex configuration of Samba, there's lots of good books out there. Samba Unleashed is a good book, which I think it's you know, it's a Bible. It's a super thick book, and it has all sorts of different configuration settings. There's lots of sample configuration files out on the internet that you can poke around to see if somebody else is doing something similar to you, and you know, whatever complexity you want to add to Samba, I bet there's a parameter that achieves that complexity for you. And the last thing I want to talk about here on the whiteboard before we go back out to the Linux screen is how do we configure Samba? Well, one of the ways is that we can just edit this smb.conf file by hand. Okay, so we can just use like the VI editor, the Emacs editor, and go through and make all the settings ourselves. All right. If we do it by hand, I suggest using this test parm facility and just say test parm smb.conf, and that will check the syntax of the configuration file. So this is a good way to, if you're going to do it by hand, this is a good way to double check your things to make sure that the configuration file, everything was in there, it was read correctly, and you formatted everything correctly, and so on. There's other more modern ways to configure Samba, though. On SUSE Linux, the YAST utility, the system tool utility, has a Samba configuration section in it, and that's one way to configure it. But on other versions of Linux, there's other tools that you can use. The SWAT tool is a really nice tool, and we'll take a look at that tool in this nugget. And that stands for the Samba Web Administration Tool. So you open up a web browser like Firefox, and you go to a particular address, and that allows you to configure Samba on your system. And Webmin is a similar kind of thing. Webmin is a web administration tool that people have written that allows you to configure all sorts of various aspects of your system through this web interface, and one of the aspects of your system that you can configure with Webmin is Samba. Okay, so let's move out to the Linux screen now and take a look at how we can set up Samba so that we can share some of our Linux directories with the local Windows box. All right, well, the first thing I want to do at the Linux screen here is just look at how to use YAST to configure the Samba server. All right, so to get into YAST, you have to type the root password, which I've already taken care of. Then you come down here to Network Services, you click on that, and then you scroll down, and then there's a link for Samba Server. When you click on that link for Samba Server, then what happens is it takes a few seconds, and it goes through this whole checking of the various configuration files and to see you know, what is actually being shared and all that sort of stuff. And then it brings up this screen. Now on this screen there's three tabs: Startup, Shares, and Identity. All Startup does is it has a couple little buttons for whether you want Samba to start up automatically when you boot or whether you want to start it manually. It also has some information about firewall settings. So if you have a firewall in your system, it allows you to open up ports so that you know, there can be some communication via Samba between two computers behind the firewall. Okay, and then there's shares. This is where the most of the important stuff is. This is where all the different things are being shared. Now, all of these settings in here, a lot of these, I should say, are done by default. So when you start Samba in SUSE Linux, this is kind of the default configuration. And down here at the bottom, one of the one of the shares is for the /home directory. Notice it's done for all users, and the name of the share is called users. Now that's important because when we go back out to the Windows screen, we need to make sure that you know, we use that share name when we try to connect to our Samba server. And the other thing that's important for connecting is the work group or the domain name. And the work group name that I've used is called NuggetNet. Okay, so I've got a little network set up. I've called it NuggetNet on my Linux machine. On my Windows machine that I'm going to use to connect to my Linux machine, it's also called NuggetNet, and that's going to allow me to connect. Okay, so I've already set all this up, so I don't have to go through the finish process. I'm just going to abort this because I didn't actually make any changes. And then what I want to do now is just look at other ways to configure Samba. Well, another way to configure Samba is with the SWAT tool that I was talking about, the web administration tool. And what you do here, you have to make sure SWAT is enabled on your system, and you can enable that as a network service. So if you go to Network Services, you click on inetd, that'll bring up this screen. And on this screen is an entry for SWAT. You can also do this manually by doing what we've talked about before by going into the appropriate directories and turning on the SWAT service. In the YAS tool, it basically amounts to clicking on this and then toggling the status to turn it on, which I've already done, as you can see. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this, and then what I'm going to do is bring up a web browser. I've got my Firefox web browser here, and type in localhost:901, and that brings up the SWAT tool. Okay, now what you can do is you can look at the various buttons up here. If you click on shares, for instance, it will show you all the different shares that are available. So I can say choose a share. I can choose the user's share. Remember, that's the one for the home directories. I click on that share, I say choose it, and then what it will do is it will show me all of the settings that is there. So the path for this share is /home, and then it goes down, and you can see I've allowed hosts just on my local domain, so 192.168.1.0, and then I've given this net mask. So anything that starts with 192.168.1 will be allowed to access my Samba system, but nothing outside of that will be allowed to access my Samba system. And you can set all sorts of other options. You can set it to be browsable and so on. There's also an advanced tab up here. So if you want to change the view to advanced, you click on that, and then the multitude of options expands by like 5 or 10, a factor of 5 or 10, you know, and you can set all kinds of other different things. I'm going to leave that for your own exploration if you want to look at all the advanced settings that you can make. But again, you know, this is just another way to configure the Samba system. You can also click on status so that you can see what the current state of the system is, who's connected, from what machines are they connected, what shares are they accessing. You can change passwords. You need a Samba password to interact with the Samba web tool here. I've already typed that password in. That password can be set via this link or via the YAST tool as well. And so all of those elements, you know, like I said, everything that the YAST tool can do, the SWAT tool can do as well. It's just a matter of preference which one you prefer. And if you're not on a SUSE Linux system, then of course you don't have the YAST tool at your disposal. So the SWAT tool is a more universal option. Now, another thing that you have to set up on the Linux side of things is you have to set up a Samba account for the people that are going to log on from the Windows machine. So one way that you can do this is with the command line, and you can say Samba password, and you could say -a, little a, Perry. So this would add an account Perry to the Samba password file, and this is sort of separate from like the regular you know, Etsy password file. Okay, so this would add a user Perry to the Samba system, and that would allow, then it would prompt you for a password. I've already set this up, so I don't need to go through this, but what this would do is it would prompt you for a password, then it would have you type it again just to double check. But this is critical to being allowing Perry to log on from the Windows machine. Okay, well now here we are over on the Windows machine, and what I've done is I've brought up under my computer, and I clicked on View Workgroup Computers, and this is what's come up. So you can see the Nugget SUSE machine is visible from my Windows machine. However, this won't be visible the very first time you bring this up. What you need to do is you need to say add a network place. That's going to bring up this little wizard, and you're going to say next, and you're going to say choose another location and go next, and then you need to type in the internet or network address of the thing that you want to add as a network place. What we do for this is we do the double slash and then we give the IP address or the name for the machine that has the Samba server on it. My Nugget SUSE machine on the local IP address is 192.168.1.101, and then the share that we want to access is /users. Okay, remember that was the home directories for the computers. If I hit enter, if I hit next here, then it will prompt me for a username and a password, and this is when I would type Perry and the password that I've added via this SMB password command on the Linux side of things. Okay, and like I said, I've already set this up, so I don't need to go through this again, so I'm just going to cancel. But now that I've set all that up, when I view the work group and this machine comes up, Nugget SUSE, in addition to my local machine, media, that's what my local Windows machine is called, I can just double click on this machine and then I get all the different things that are shared. The printers, the users, the profiles, and then the Perry directory. Okay, so the users directory, the user share is, shows me different accounts on the Linux machine. There's an administrator account on the Linux machine. There's a Perry account on the Linux machine. I can go into the administrator's account and see things, but I couldn't do something like make a new folder. Okay, it says access is denied because Perry does not have privileges in the administrator directory. But if I go back and I go into the Perry directory and then I go into documents there I could make a new folder. I can call it junk. I can go into that folder. I can create, copy files into this. I can do whatever I want in this directory because I have permissions, because the way that that was set up by default was that you had to supply a username and a password, and that username and password gave you specific access to your directories on the Linux machine. So you weren't able to just go in and wreak havoc on everybody else's things that were shared. Okay, so there is a password protection there. Make sure that when you're setting things up that you use encrypted passwords for modern versions of Windows. Anything like Windows XP, Windows 2000, any of those editions except for like Windows 95. If you're that old, then you should use unencrypted passwords. But any of the modern versions, Windows 98 or later, you need to make sure you're using encrypted passwords so that everything communicates correctly. But that's pretty much all that there is to Samba to set up a very simple sharing between your Linux and Windows machine. All right, well, now let's move on and talk about the Network File System, abbreviated NFS. This was developed by Sun Microsystems, and the idea of the Network File System is that it allows Linux machines to share files. Okay, it was actually developed for Unix initially, but it's been imported into Linux as well. So the typical uses of NFS are to share home directories between hosts and a network. So if you've got a lot of computers out here, and say you're at a university and there's a lab, and users could log on to any one of these computers, well, you don't want to have a home directory mounted on each computer for each user, and you really don't even want that because then when you log on here and you create some file in your home directory, then if you logged on here later, that file that you created in your home directory earlier over here would not be present over here. So you want to have one central repository out here. There's going to be some NFS server with some big disk, and then all the the /home directories are going to live here. And then all of these machines, whenever they reference /home, they will really be referencing the disk on this particular server machine that's out here. Okay, so that's one use for NFS. And another use is to share binaries. So again, if you have some NFS server out here in the /bin directory or /user bin and all those different directories that are out there that contain executables can all be contained on the server out here. And then when any of these computers go to run that program, well, they run it from there. Now, this seems like a little bit of a bottleneck, and you could run into problems with bottlenecks depending on how many machines are accessing this NFS server. But the big win for using NFS is that you're saving space. You don't have to copy these binaries out to all these different computers, and you're also saving system administration time. When you want to upgrade some piece of software, you just upgrade it on the NFS server, and then when any of these people run the new Firefox browser or something, well, then it's running the newest version that you've updated in one place. You didn't have to go out to each of these machines and update it. So that's the kinds of benefits that you gain from NFS and the typical uses that we see with NFS. So the overview here, like I was just drawing there, is the NFS server lives out here, and it has, a file system on it, okay? And then the NFS client over here will basically take certain things from the NFS server when it needs it. So like I was saying earlier, we could have the /home directory here, and that could be shared amongst a bunch of different clients. And then whenever someone here references, they say cd/home, well, really they're being taken to the home directory on the server machine. And when they do an ls there, that's really doing an ls on this machine and sending the output back to the client machine. Okay, if they do a make dir or delete a file or create a file or something like that, all of that stuff is done on the remote machine. Okay, so that's basically the way it's working here, client-server architecture. So the configuration files for NFS that are important, well, host.allow and host.deny in the etc directory just configure who can access your machines. Allow is always checked first, and if there's a specification for this machine to access yours and it's in the allow file, then it's allowed to access. If it's not in the allowed file, then the deny file is checked, and if it's in there, then it's denied access. However, if it's in neither of these machines, then it's allowed access by default. The etc exports file is where you actually configure what directories are exported and what their properties are, whether they're read-only or read-write, or whether they're always going to be synced up, or you're going to allow asynchronous behavior, that sort of thing. So what I want to do now is move out to the Linux screen. We're going to take a look at a couple different Linux machines on my network and show you how to configure NFS and show it to you in action. All right, so here we are on the Nugget SUSE machine. This is going to be my NFS server for the network. And then we'll move over to a separate machine, a little laptop that I have called Nugget SUSE 2, and that's going to be the NFS client for the network. Okay, so on the Nugget SUSE machine, which is the server, you have to set up a few things in the etc directory like we were just talking about. The first thing is that host.allow file, and in there I've just set it up simply to allow all the services to access this machine from the local domain 192.168.1 dot, and that just says anything in the local domain that starts with those 3 octets can access this machine for any service at all. Okay, so that's the simple way to set that up. Then we can look at the exports file, and in the exports file you can see I've exported the user local directory. There's the machine that I've exported it to, okay, and then these are some options that I've set for that machine. All right, so 192.168.1.0/netmask 255.255.255.0, they're all the same. That's the same thing that we were specifying up here. Anything that starts with 192.168.1 can access user local on this machine. Now the RO here says it's read-only, so the client machine will be able to read the files in user local but not write to them. Obviously, if we were exporting /home or something like that, then you would want this to be readable and writable, and for that option you would use RW. Root squash has to do with whether the root user is accessing something over the NFS server, and the root squash is just like a safety mechanism to make sure that bad things can't happen. I'll leave it at that. If you want to allow the root user to be root on the NFS server while they're accessing the files, then you would write no root squash. And then sync has to do with the client-server synchronization. The opposite of sync is async, A-S-Y-N-C, for asynchronous behavior. So the sync option says that when the client does a write to the server, it doesn't give control back to the user until the server says, yes, I've carried out this write, go on. And then if it does that at every step of the way, does that little handshake every step of the way, then you know the data integrity is good. Every time you do a write on the client, you know that the write has been carried out on the server. The async option can be faster in certain circumstances, but you risk some data integrity issues because you might be doing a write on the client, but then it actually doesn't get carried out on the server, and the server crashes and something happens. You know, so that sort of behavior is somewhat unpredictable when you have async. But in high performance, certain kinds of situations, you might want async as your option. Now, to edit the Etsy exports file, you can obviously just go in and edit it by hand, okay? But you can also use various tools. There's a graphical tool in SUSE. If you go to Network Services and you click on NFS Server, then you will get this screen. And it's very primitive in what it does. It just basically allows a little bit of savings from using an editor. So you can add a directory here. You can browse through directories if you want to do that. If you just want to edit, you know, what the options are for a directory that you've already got, you can click edit. But you can see the options here. You just go in and type them by hand. So in a couple minutes, I'll point you to a resource on the internet where you can learn about all the other different options. Obviously, you can look at the man pages for NFS and the Etsy exports file to see all the different kinds of options that you can set up. But once you get all this set up, then you would click finish, and that would set up those directories to be exported on your system. And now what I want to do is go over to the client machine and look at how we set up, how we import this particular directory from the server. All right, well now here we are over at the Nugget SUSE 2 machine. This is my NFS client, and the way that you operate this is we want to create a mount point for this particular file that we're going to mount, the NFS mount. And what I've done is I've created a file in the mount directory called nugget1 user local, all one word, okay, just as a temporary mount point to show you how to do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to issue the mount command, and the way that we give this is we give the IP address of the server machine and the directory that we want to mount. And then we give the local mount point, just like you would think, nugget1 user local. We do that, and that's going to take a couple seconds, and then it's going to have the user local machine from the NFS server mount it in this directory. And if we go into that directory, then you'll see if we do an ls, there it is. There's the user local machine from Nugget SUSE 1. Okay, and we're seeing it on Nugget SUSE 2. Now, typically the way that you would set this up for an actual user local, you would mount this to, you know, user local on the machine, on the client machine, and then when somebody says cd user local, it goes into user local, but really it is the user local on Nugget SUSE 1, and that's all there is to it on the client side of things. One last thing I just wanted to point you to is the Linux NFS how-to. If you search for NFS how-to in Google, you'll find 100 different copies around the internet of this file. It's a very thorough file. It talks all about NFS, gives you some background knowledge, talks about setting up a server and a client like we've done. One of the things that we didn't talk about on the client side was how do you get the NFS file system to be mounted at boot time? What we did was we just mounted it by hand by typing the mount command, but you really want an NFS file system to be mounted when the system boots up, so the user doesn't have to go through that mounting process or even understand that they're getting directories from some NFS server. And the way that you do that is you just add an entry to the Etsy FS tab file. So what you do is in that entry, you first specify the name of the NFS server, and for their example is master.foo.com. For us, it was 192.168.1.101 :/ the name of the directory that server is exporting, like in their example /home. For us, it was user local. Then you give the mount point, and then you give the file system type, and for NFS imported files, that the file system type is just NFS. Even though the underlying file system on the server might be ext3 or riser or something else, it just says NFS on the client machine to let the system know that it's a networked file system. Then options are like the read write or read only or sync or whatever, and you don't have to worry about these out here. That's a little bit more detail than we need to get into. But That's all you have to do to get that to be mounted at boot time. The how-to file also goes over things like security. It goes over optimizing and tuning NFS. So lots of information about NFS is in here if you want to carry on your learning process. And that pretty much wraps up our discussion of NFS. All right, well, it's time to wrap up our nugget on Samba and NFS. We started by talking about the Samba system, which is the system that allows Windows and Linux machines to communicate back and forth. And we went through an example where we set up a shared directory on Linux, and we saw how to access it from Windows. And similarly, you could set things up on Windows and access them from Linux. Samba also gives you the ability to access printers over the network. And remember that the main configuration file for Samba is samba smb.conf, and on the SUSE Linux machines that lives in /etc/samba, and other versions of Linux that lives in just the etc directory. And then we moved on to talk about NFS. NFS is more common, is the most common way really to access share files and access files between multiple Linux machines. It's very useful for saving space and saving system administration time. So you don't have to have replications of directories on lots of machines in the network. You can just have one copy of critical directories like binary executables on one NFS server, and then many NFS clients can access that from one place. We looked at the major configuration file for NFS, and that was etc exports on the server side of things. And then on the client side of things, you have to make an entry into etc fs tab to make the client mount the exported file system automatically. All right, well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks for watching.